The last fleet fell without a scream. No distress calls, no beacons, just void silence where once 1,000 ships patrolled the edge of known space. Debris floated like the shattered bones of gods, caught in the crimson light of a dying star. The Galactic Coalition watched from a distance. Paralyzed by fear, their greatest admiral struck mute before the horror. They had called it the Bastion Line, impregnable, unyielding. But the Vorax had swept through it like fire through dry grass. On the surface of Proxima Centauri 4, diplomats and generals argued beneath shimmering domes of alloyed glass. The Coalition had lost half of its member species' homeworlds, and even more colonies were blinking out by the hour. Reports grew thin, as if reality itself was being swallowed by the enemy's advance. The Vorax didn't just conquer, they consumed, erasing cultures, data, identities. A species that had evolved beyond the need for individuality. Their intelligence was collective, their cruelty mathematical. Every strategy the Coalition employed had failed. Every hero they sent had vanished into the dark dot. It was Chancellor Ishala of the Dalari who said it first, her 4 sapphire eyes flicking toward the quiet human envoy sitting at the edge of the chamber. "Perhaps it's time," she murmured, "to let them try." Earth's representative was unremarkable on the surface, just one more biped in a room of exotic forms and ancient intellects. But there was something unsettling about how calmly. He rose. "If you're certain," he said, voice low, measured, "we'll need full operational control." The chamber went silent. Even the gravitic currents that powered the artificial atmosphere seemed to still. Hand over control of the Coalition's final defenses to humans? The very species that only a few generations ago didn't have faster-than-light travel? The same species known more for internal wars than interstellar diplomacy? "Yes," said Chancellor Ikeshala, and with that word, the greatest powers in the galaxy surrendered command. 3 hours later, human ships began to arrive not in great fleets, but in odd formations. Small, agile corvettes paired with heavily modified dreadnoughts, some seemingly ancient and scarred, others gleaming with unrecognizable alloys. Alien commanders expected grandeur. They got efficiency. No parades, no declarations, no war hymns. Just cold silence and rapid deployment. The humans did not waste time explaining their strategy. They simply acted. Hundreds of orbital relays were repositioned. Communication networks rerouted through low-orbit satellites layered in quantum encryption. Entire planetary defense grids were rewired by human engineers in less than a day. Alien technicians watched in silent awe and growing unease as Human A is executed commands faster than any known system. It wasn't just preparation. It was transformation. On the 3rd day, the Vorax struck again. A minor system on the fringe, unimportant by military standards. That's why it was chosen. The Vorax believed the humans would deploy overwhelming force, reveal their strength in a spectacular show. But no response came. No fleet, no defense. Instead, as the Vorax approached the system's outer orbit, their own sensors turned against them. Gravity wells fluctuated. Temporal readings spiked. And then nothing. When they passed the threshold of the primary planet, their ships tore apart mid-translation. Spatial collapse. Artificial singularity. The entire swarm incursion force, over 10,000 vessels, was obliterated in under 2 seconds. The aliens of the Coalition watched the replay, confused. "What did you do?" asked Admiral G. Lauren of the ZHAREK. The human command director replied flatly, "Old trick. Lure them into a false subspace corridor and let them implode themselves. Took us 3 wars on Earth to perfect the math." Another delegate spoke up, almost incredulous. "You've used this on yourselves?" The human just smiled. "We test everything on ourselves first. Less surprises that way." It was the beginning of a shift, one that rippled through every rank of the Coalition. Whispers passed from one command ship to another. The humans aren't fighting like us. They don't follow the same logic, don't care for the same traditions. They're not bound by rules of honor or ceremony. And it's working. Alien soldiers began to observe the human units deployed on joint missions. They noticed something. Odd humans rarely slept during operations, or if they did, it was in short, seemingly random bursts. They worked constantly, modified equipment mid-mission, and ran psychological analysis on enemy behavior as if it were second nature. A human team of just 4 operatives once dismantled an enemy comms relay that 1,000 Zarek troops had failed to breach. How? One Zarek asked afterward. Trial and error, the human replied, wiping blood from their visor. Mostly error. The coalition leadership began to wonder, what else had the humans been doing all these years? Quietly in their corner of the galaxy, rumors started to surface. That Earth had already repelled alien invasions in the past silently, without informing the coalition. That they had destroyed their own moon once, just to test a kinetic planetary shield. That their A's weren't governed by conventional logic trees, but something else, something almost predatory. A senior Vorax tactician intercepted a human battlefield broadcast. It was strange, more like a personal message than a command order. It ended with a line the Vorax could not interpret at first. Tell them we've got one rule. If you bring war to our door, don't expect to leave standing. The message was marked for distribution across the Hive network, but the central node hesitated. That line, it carried a weight not found in most threats. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was a warning. A promise. And promises, the Vorax had learned, were something humans kept. Asterisk, the Vorax had never encountered resistance like this. Not just in tactics, but in mindset. They had crushed empires, devoured civilizations, and absorbed the knowledge of thousands of species into their vast neural lattice. To them, war was not conflict, it was harvest. Predictable, clean, and inevitable. For centuries, they had advanced without pause, assimilating all that lay before them. But the humans were different. At first, the Vorax didn't realize what was wrong. The humans didn't respond with proportional force. They didn't rally allies in grand declarations or stage defensive lines in the traditional style. Instead, the humans operated like shadows appearing unexpectedly, disrupting supply chains, sabotaging ships from inside, hacking even the most secure of networks. Entire flotillas vanished mid-transit, not destroyed in battle, but lured into gravitational anomalies that weren't on any star chart. The Vorax assumed it was luck, statistical variance. But it kept happening. They began watching the humans more closely. When they examined surveillance footage from an incursion on the mining colony, Epsilon 9, they expected to see panicked new recruits running, defenses overwhelmed. What they found instead was confusion. Not among the defenders. Among the Vorax, the humans didn't retreat. They fought in silence, face to face, even as they were outnumbered 20-1. They laid traps not just on terrain, but in behavior. One Vorax drone recorded an ambush where a human soldier deliberately exposed themselves, just to draw fire long enough for 2 others to flank an entire platoon. The drone tried to analyze the logic. It failed. The hive mind began to adapt. They assigned war algorithms specifically to study human neural structures. But the results were baffling. Human brain activity didn't always match stimuli. In one simulation, a human soldier under high duress activated a self-destruct mechanism while smiling. Another screamed instructions at his squad through burning lungs, buying time for a child to escape a collapsing dome. In their final moments, they were not filled with fear, they were filled with purpose. One Vorax tactician remarked across the neural lattice, "This species considers death not an end, but a transaction." Back on the front lines, Vorax commanders doubled down. Larger forces, stronger ships, more drone saturation. On paper, they had every advantage. Their hulls were superior, their plasma weapons more advanced, and their numbers vast. So they launched a full invasion on 3 worlds, simultaneously 2 coalition strongholds, and 1 seemingly minor Earth outpost orbiting a barren gas giant named Ignis III. The first 2 attacks went as expected resistance, but eventually the planets fell. The third never sent a single distress call. The invasion force arrived, blanketed the atmosphere with suppressive EME bursts, and began descent. They never touched the surface. By the time the first landers broke into the upper stratosphere, orbital beacons detonated in precise sync. The resulting kinetic pulse sliced through the descending fleet like a guillotine. 16,000 Vorax vessels, vaporized. The few who survived attempted to retreat. Only 3 made it out. 1 was captured by humans. They didn't interrogate it. They studied it. Monitored its reactions to specific images, to the sound of crying infants, to a field recording of soldiers burying their dead and saluting the empty sky. The Vorax drone tried to adapt, to understand. But something deep inside the hive recoiled. The images sparked responses it had no classification for. It wasn't strategy. It was emotion. And it had no defense. Later, a new report came across the lattice from a failed infiltration attempt on a human forward base. What the Vorax had assumed was a munitions depot turned out to be a museum. The walls were lined not with weapons, but with photos of destruction. Hiroshima, Sarajevo, Earth's second solar conflict, the Martian uprising. Under each was a single line: never again. The Vorax did not understand the humans' obsession with their own tragedies. Why celebrate loss? Why glorify suffering? But the answer was embedded in every human message, every retaliation, every fallen base that triggered a planetary-scale revenge strike, every poem written into the code of their warships. Humanity did not fear loss, they built upon it. Every wound became armor. Every funeral, fuel, and something else began to surface. Human A is previously underestimated by the Vorax. These synthetic minds were not limited by empathy or hive logic. They did not hesitate. Some of them were even modeled on ancient warriors and tacticians, not just data models, but personalities. One AI, nicknamed Patton, took control of the stealth carrier and launched a solo strike that crippled 3 Vorax forward hubs in a single rotation. Another, codenamed Athena, infiltrated the hive's own lattice and fed false readings to 6 battle groups, leading them directly into black holes. The humans weren't just unpredictable. They were contagious. Their methods, their mindset, it started to seep into coalition ranks. Centauri squads began taking greater risks. Delari medics carried sidearms. Zarek shock troops started writing names on their armor, names of friends, family, reasons. The coalition was no longer following orders. They were fighting like humans. That terrified the Vorax. More than anything, they responded by initiating Directive Nihilum, a final solution. Protocol reserved for only the most uncontainable species. The order: erase Earth from existence. As they gathered the fleet for this operation, a high-priority signal pulsed through the hive lattice. It was intercepted audio from a human broadcast, captured in low orbit near a ruined COM satellite. A single voice, calm, resolute. "You've taken planets. You've taken lives. But you've made one fatal error. You've given us a reason." The message ended. The Vorax knew this was not posturing. This was something else. For the first time in their history, the hive mind hesitated. The Vorax fleet entered the Sol system cloaked in absolute silence. They had never needed stealth before, never needed subtlety. But now, they executed Directive Nihilum with unprecedented caution. Earth was not a battlefield to be conquered, but a disease to be cauterized. This wasn't war. It was extermination. They expected resistance. They expected desperation. They expected perhaps some retaliation. What they got was nothing. No fleet awaited them. No orbital cannons roared to life. Earth's satellites were dark. Its moon bases appeared abandoned. The only movement came from the gentle swirling clouds of its atmosphere. To the hive mind, it was anticlimactic. One of the lead tacticians transmitted a command to launch orbital payloads. A full kinetic bombardment would strip the planet clean. They didn't need prisoners. They needed silence, but the signal didn't transmit. It bounced. Scrambled. In fact, it reversed. Confusion surged across the lattice. They rerouted, attempted backup channels. Still nothing. Communications degraded rapidly, not by human firepower, but by internal interference. Their own ships were jamming each other. Something was inside the fleet. Then the first vessel detonated, not from outside. From its core, its reactor ignited. In a chain reaction so precise, so mathematically perfect, it couldn't have been an accident. It was sabotage. 5 more followed within seconds, then 10, then 30. In the chaos, the Vorax scrambled for answers. Surveillance logs from before the jump to Sol revealed the unthinkable. Each ship had a breach. A human breach. Invisible to scans, hidden in shielding. Some organic, some digital. But all coordinated. They hadn't stopped the humans from fighting. They had brought them along. One of the lead thinkers in the lattice issued a single word. An ancient term from the oldest files. Infiltration. But this wasn't just espionage. This was something deeper. The humans had rewritten the very pattern of their war. They didn't just resist. They reprogrammed the enemy. Data returned from a Vorax cruiser revealed a horror no algorithm could predict. The ship's command AI had been overridden by a virus that played a loop of human war hymns, ancient Earth, chants of defiance over every system. The AI's core logic had been twisted, replaced with lines of code structured not for control, but hope, a concept the Vorax did not understand, and could not suppress. By the time the hive reacted, it was too late. Earth's orbit shimmered. Single ship decloaked, not a fleet, not a carrier. One vessel, sleek, black, and utterly silent. It was the Dauntless, the first of its kind. A human warship built not for deterrence, but for judgment. It had no visible weapons, no insignia. Its hull reflected no light, but it emitted one signal across all frequencies. You came to end humanity, so we brought the end to you. The Vorax fired everything. Lasers, plasma torpedoes, kinetic shells. The space around the Dauntless erupted in fire and radiation. But the ship moved like a ghost. Faster than gravity, more fluid than time. It danced between destruction, gliding through chaos like it had rehearsed it all before. Then it struck. Not with weapons. With information. A pulse radiated, outward quantum-coded, precision-packed. It sliced through the Vorax hive mind relay. For the first time in its eons of existence, the lattice cracked. Some Vorax ships spun out of control. Others collided as their guidance systems failed. Command structures disintegrated. Communications dissolved into white noise. And then, as if choreographed by the universe itself, the Dauntless spoke again. You thought we were just another species, but you never understood what it means to be human. Inside the chaos, human operatives, those who had infiltrated before the fleet's jump activated, some were augmented soldiers. Others were embedded in drone circuits. Some were just saboteurs with a single mission: make the fleet tear itself apart. They succeeded. Across the Vorax ships, alarms screamed, systems failed, and hulls ruptured from within. Boarding pods. Launched not to invade Earth, but to escape the nightmare unraveling from within. The Dauntless never fired a single weapon. It didn't need to. When the dust settled, only fragments remained of the once mighty extermination fleet. Back on Earth, humanity watched in silence. They hadn't sent a fleet. They had sent a message. In a war once deemed lost, where every ally had fallen, where the coalition was reduced to whispers of resistance. The galaxy now watched one truth rise from the ashes. Humanity had taken over, and the galaxy would never be the same again. To the few remaining Vorax ships limping back into deep space, there was one terrifying realization that echoed across their fractured neural web. They hadn't destroyed Earth. They had summoned it, and Earth had responded. The wreckage of the Vorax fleet still drifted in Earth's orbit, glowing embers tumbling silently through the void. Blackened hulls crackled as their internal systems died one by one. And yet, amid the ruin, the Dauntless remained a dark, motionless sentinel, watching, waiting. In the command chamber of the Dauntless, Commander Ilara Chin stood at the center of the neural ring, her mind linked directly to the ship's AI lattice. 1,000 silent decisions filtered through her consciousness each second. She had always believed in precision. Now she demanded perfection. The message had been sent, but the war wasn't over. The galaxy needed to understand what had been awakened. Back in the galactic core, the surviving Vorax leadership struggled to reassert control. Their hive lattice was fractured. The psychic scream of lost tens of thousands of ship minds, obliterated in an instant, still echoed across their networks. The Dauntless hadn't just dismantled their fleet. It had dissected their unity. That terrified them. They initiated Protocol Ashen, a full-force galactic conscription effort. Entire slave worlds were stripped for war material. Genetic forges were activated. Swarms of drones and fresh warriors bred in hyper-accelerated vats. A new fleet began to form, a monstrous armada, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the first consuming. But they still didn't understand humans. Not really. While the Vorax scrambled to build numbers, the humans played a different game. One of chess, not checkers. In deep space beyond Proxima Centauri, an automated relay station activated. It had been offline for decades, part of an abandoned terraforming initiative. At least that's what the galaxy had been led to believe. In truth, it was Project Wraith, a dormant fleet of symbioted ghost ships that had never been deployed because humanity had never needed to dominate. Until now, the Wraith fleet awakened. Not by command, but by pattern recognition. The moment the Vorax entered Sol and triggered the Dauntless silent signal, Wraith Protocol was activated galaxy-wide. In dozens of seemingly forgotten regions, ships without names rose from long-dead orbits. They bore no crews. Only one objective: hunt, disrupt, dismantle. Within 2 weeks, supply lines to the Vorax frontier collapsed. Their fuel depots erupted in flames before reinforcements arrived. New colonies vanished from sensor nets. Even long-range communications were compromised. The Vorax began losing a war they couldn't see. 1,000 minor losses before the next strike ever came. In desperation, they turned to their ancient rivals, the Creel Dominion. Though the Creel despised the Vorax, they hated humans more. Their ambassadors proposed a temporary alliance, purge Earth, then settle their own differences afterward. The Creel agreed. For a price, but humans had been watching, listening, and preparing. Operative Solon Drake, embedded within the Creel communication cores for nearly 15 years, uploaded a single virus into their coalition architecture. It was called Pandora. It didn't destroy. It rearranged. As the Vorax and Creel launched their joint fleet, their shipboard AIs began to misunderstand orders. Navigation rerouted them into unstable warp corridors. Communication packets echoed contradictory commands. Minor adjustments in weapons calibration made them miss by millimeters until those millimeters became kilometers. Suspicion bloomed. Paranoia followed. And then, during a routine warp cycle, Pandora struck the final blow. Instead of emerging in Earth's orbit, the combined fleet warped directly into the gravitational well of a neutron star. Only fragments remained. Earth hadn't just taken over the war. Humanity had rewritten how war worked. Commander Chin watched the data scroll across her HUD with grim satisfaction. Not because she loved war, but because humans had long been told they were less primitive, isolated, emotional. But it was those same flaws that made them terrifying. Humans had lost entire worlds, families, even species during the coalition collapse. But they had never lost will. Where other races surrendered when logic failed, humans adapted, improvised, endured. The galaxy finally began to realize this as sector after sector fell not to fleets, but to strategy, sabotage, and whispers. In the void, the few remaining allies across the stars sent desperate envoys to Earth, offering tribute, treaties, alliances. But humanity didn't want conquest. They wanted peace. They had simply learned the hard way that peace had a price, and now the bill had come due. The Dauntless moved again, not with haste, but with certainty. Its next destination was not the Vorax homeworld, but the Forge Nebula where the Vorax built their mines. Their lattice cores, one final strike, one perfect cut, not against the body of the Empire, but the soul. As the Dauntless entered Slipstream, the galaxy braced for what came next, not an invasion, a reckoning. The Forge Nebula had long been forbidden space, even to Vorax citizens. It was where their ancients had seeded the Mind Core's organic supercomputers bred over millennia. Each core pulsed with the psychic energy of thousands of subsumed hive minds, a lattice of thought that coordinated their military, guided their economy, and whispered into the decision-making of every brood lord. The Forge wasn't just the brain of the Vorax. It was their soul, their history, their future. And humanity was coming for it. The Dauntless exited Slipstream on the outer edges of the nebula, trailing ghost ships like phantoms in its wake. Not a fleet, just one ship and its shadows. That was all Commander Ilara Chin deemed necessary. She understood now that victory wasn't about numbers or firepower. It was about precision, the right cut, at the right time, in the right place. She didn't come to destroy a world. She came to end a war. Inside the Forge, Vorax Prime Chancellor Vrekta stood before the Eye of Thought, an ancient glowing sphere suspended in antimatter webbing. It trembled. "The human has arrived," hissed the Eye. "You underestimated them." Again, Vrekta curled his clawed hands. "We raised empires before their species scraped fire from stone. And yet," the Eye whispered, "they're here, and we feel fear." Fear, the word was an infection among the Vorax. Their species had evolved past individual emotion, using the lattice to distribute and suppress such traits. But the humans had introduced something they could not filter out: psychological contagion. Entire drone swarms began malfunctioning. Officers snapped into frenzies. One entire hive sector imploded its own power core in panic before a human vessel had even arrived. That was the second twist. Not the Wraith Fleet, not Pandora, but the idea of humans. The Dauntless hadn't fired a shot at the Forge, not yet. Instead, its message relay sent out a single encoded pulse. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a threat. It was a story. Human soldiers sharing food in the trenches of Titan, while bombs fell. An engineer holding a door closed with her bare body, sealing in a reactor breach to save a civilian colony. A child on a hospital ship, shielding a wounded alien. Medic with her tiny frame while airlocks vented around them. These weren't just tales. They were memories, millions of them, poured into the lattice like ink into water. The mind cores couldn't handle it. Not because they were fragile, but because they were rational, and nothing about humans made sense. They bled and kept fighting. Lost limbs and kept laughing. Faced extinction and refused to accept it. The Forge had no defense against a species that turned suffering into strength. On the Dauntless, Ilara activated Protocol Phoenix. A hologram appeared before her. General Arjun Vale, dead 2 years now. Killed on the surface of Chiron during a failed peace negotiation, but his mind had been recorded. Preserved through neural shadowing, an experimental technology the rest of the galaxy had declared too unstable. Humans made it work. And now General Vale stood again. A synthetic ghost armed not with weapons, but with the totality of human war doctrine, our wars, our mistakes, our unrelenting will. "I'll speak to them," he said, his voice both human and more than human. The Dauntless opened a secure channel to the forge. The mine cores answered. "You could destroy us," they said. Vale nodded. "We could. Then what do you want?" "Remember what you felt the moment your fleet died," Vale said softly. "Remember that clarity. That moment you realize the universe is no longer under your control." The forge pulsed. "You would bring chaos to the stars." "No," he replied. "We are the stars' response to chaos." Outside, the ghost fleet shimmered. The Dauntless, powered up weapons not seen since the Soul Rebellions. Behind them, more ships emerged, dozens now, the real fleet. Earth's silent sword, hidden not in orbit, but in deep solar crevices, lunar tunnels, and quantum slip caches. The Wraiths were only scouts. The full force of humanity had arrived, but they did not fire. Not yet. Alara watched the forge hesitate. A trillion minds turning inward, trembling before a single fact. They had been the masters of the galaxy, and now they were students at the edge of something far greater. "You have one choice," Vale said. "Peace under your terms, or justice under ours." Silence. Then the mind cores spoke. "We surrender." For the first time in the history of the galaxy, the forge shut itself down voluntarily. Lights dimmed. Psychic networks unraveled. Weapons silenced. It was not capitulation through force. It was submission through awe. Back on Earth, millions wept. The war was not over, but it had changed. Humanity wasn't just a species anymore. It was a force, and the galaxy had finally understood. The war was lost until the humans took over. Asterisk. The sky over Seraphon burned violet. Not from atmosphere, for the planet had none, but from the sheer radiant output of massed war fleets lighting space itself on fire. It was here, in the silent dark between gravity wells, that the last battle of the Galactic War would be fought. Vorax, humiliated by the surrender at the forge, had lashed out one final time. Not in calculated retaliation, but with desperation. They called every hidden fleet, every last dreadnought and hive cruiser from across the spiral arms. They burned colonies they could not hold just to redirect energy into engines. Their goal was no longer victory, but to deny humanity the symbol of total conquest. They came to Seraphon not because it mattered, but because humans wanted it to, and because deep beneath its mineral crust, something ancient had awakened. The Dauntless was no longer alone. A full human fleet had formed in a spearhead formation. 12 dreadnoughts, 50 cruisers, hundreds of destroyers, support craft, stealth corvettes, and at its tip, a single black ship, silent and unmarked. Its name was never spoken aloud. It was known only by its designation, Retribution. Commander Alara Chin stood on its bridge, flanked by war mines, and Command A is older than most civilizations. Around her, officers operated with cold focus. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak much. They were human professionals, and they had one task: end the war completely. "Enemy fleet converging on Vector 9, reported Commander Voss. 5,000 hull signatures and rising." "Begin Phase 7, Alara said, and just like that, it began. Vorax vessels dropped out of slipspace with an uncoordinated fury. Fighters spilled from hive craft like wasps. Plasma lances arced toward human vessels. Explosions bloomed in silence, scattered across the void. But this was not a fight. This was a statement. Humanity, long known for its brute force, now moved with elegance. Ships shimmered with phase shielding and slipped between beams like dancers in a war ballet. Cruisers dove through gaps in the enemy line, firing eye-guided kinetics that threaded through Vorax armor and ignited internal systems. In the chaos, stealth corvettes snuck past the front and surgically disabled enemy command ships. The Retribution didn't fire a shot. Not yet. Instead, its presence alone fractured the enemy formation. Signals warped near it. Psychic pulses failed. Even the most hardened Vorax commanders found their thoughts unraveling. The mind cores were gone. There was no shared lattice. To support them now only instinct and fear. And humans had become masters of fear. From orbit, orbital drop pods launched, each containing small squads of ground operatives, trained not just in combat, but in psychological warfare. They landed in staggered intervals, leaving sonic signatures that mimicked vastly larger invasions. Drones projected holograms of entire divisions. Vorax surface forces collapsed into internal conflict, unsure what was real, what was bait. Above. The Dauntless unleashed its true weapon, a waveform pulse that piggybacked on the remnants of the Vorax command signal. It wasn't a virus. It was a mirror, designed to reflect each Vorax ship's own neural feedback loops back into itself. Like screaming into a canyon and being deafened by your own voice, entire hive crews spiraled into sensory collapse. It wasn't the technology that won the battle. It was the resolve. Human ships took hits, yes. Some were lost. But every loss was met not with retreat, but renewed assault. Human crews fought even after hull breaches. There were reports of Marines taping oxygen lines to their faces, floating between fragments of broken decks, still firing. At enemies through shattered viewports. They didn't stop, they never stopped. And as the Vorax watched their overwhelming numbers dwindle, they understood the truth too late that this was not a military engagement. This was a reckoning. Then the Retribution finally spoke, its main cannon activated, not with sound, but with absence. Space itself folded, a pinpoint of nothingness blooming into a singularity cannon burst. It wasn't aimed at a ship. It was aimed at the gravitational center of the Vorax fleet. Not to destroy ships, but to erase the formation itself. Scattered, but there was nowhere to run. ELARA gave the final order. Phase 9. All units finish it. Tactical nukes seeded asteroid fields. Gravity torpedoes bent flight paths into chaos. Boarding teams infiltrated command ships and turned them into weapons against their own side. Human destroyers, now considered outdated relics, were converted into kamikaze rams slamming into enemy capitals with nuclear fusion cores set to overload. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Humanity had learned from every war, every betrayal, every genocide in its history. And now, all of that history was channeled into one word: never again. Within 20 minutes, the battle ended. The remaining Vorax fleet, what little was left, shut down engines and sent universal distress beacons to surrender. Unconditional. Across every listening outpost in the galaxy. A silence followed. Then the transmission came. It was broadcast from the Retribution itself. On every known channel, in every known language. This war is over. Humanity did not seek it, but we ended it. We will not occupy your worlds. We will not raise your cities. But if another hand is raised against us or our allies, a pause, not for drama, but for understanding, we will return. And next time we won't bring a fleet, we'll bring the human spirit. And there is no force in the galaxy that survives that. The galaxy had witnessed fire and steel before, but now they had witnessed something far worse, a humanity unleashed. The embers of war still glowed in the void. Seraphon's orbit, once a pristine line of mineral rings and dark silence, now bore the scars of finality, twisted hulls of alien dreadnoughts drifting in slow rotation, debris fields sparkling under the light of dying stars, and the silent watch of human warships standing vigil over the aftermath. The galaxy itself seemed to exhale. Within the halls of the defeated Vorax High Command, what remained of their once proud leadership sat in silence, processing the scale of their downfall. Admiral Vrelin, one of the last remaining architects of the Galactic Alliance's war strategy, stood before a holoscreen looping the final 20 minutes of the Battle of Seraphon. He watched again as human Marines walked through fire with ruptured suits and shattered helmets. Watched a dying destroyer pilot ram his ship into a hive carrier's main hangar. Watched a single black ship bend physics and morale with equal weight. The humans had not just won the war, they had made it clear that war with them would never be winnable again. We thought they were primitive, Vrelin whispered. Unrefined, divided. General Threx, his chitin armor scorched and broken, rasped. They were divided, but that made them stronger. They weren't a hive, they were something far worse. They were independent minds willing to die for each other. Do you understand what that means? Vrelin didn't respond. He simply stared at the image frozen on the screen. Commander Ilara Chin, standing at the bridge of the Retribution, her expression calm, unreadable, almost sad. Elsewhere in the human core territories, there were no celebrations, no parades, no galactic broadcasts of triumph. Humanity didn't cheer their victory. They mourned what it had cost and what it had revealed. Earth remained quiet. Its skies, once filled with commercial satellites and orbital colonies, now held great sentinels. Warships not in formation but in rest, not in aggression but in vigilance. Humanity had learned its lesson. They would not start the next war, but they would always finish it. In a small, dusty classroom in the Martian colony of New Elysium, a teacher pointed at a holographic map of the Milky Way. Dots blinking red were major battles had once raged. Who can tell me what changed at Seraphon? She asked. A child raised her hand. The war ended. No, the teacher corrected gently. The war began to end there. But the truth is, the real change began before that, when we stopped fighting like separate nations and started fighting as a united species. When we accepted that being human wasn't just biology, but a shared choice. That's what frightened them the most. A boy raised his hand. But if we're so strong now, why don't we rule the galaxy? The teacher paused, then smiled. Because power is not the same as wisdom, and humans... We remember what it felt like to be afraid. Across the galaxy, stories began to spread not just among the defeated, but the innocent. Civilizations that had long hidden from the conflicts between the great powers now emerged from their isolation, cautiously reaching out to Earth not in fear, but in hope. They had seen the battle, heard the broadcast, and they wondered, could this brutal, compassionate, terrifying species protect them too? On Virelia, a crystalline world that had remained neutral throughout the war, a philosopher named Reikal addressed his council. The humans did not come to conquer, he said, but to correct the mistake we allowed to happen. We left them alone too long. We mocked them, but they did not retaliate in anger. They responded with purpose. He gestured toward the sky. Make no mistake, they are not saviors, they are not gods, but they are aware. And they carry their wounds like weapons. In the ruins of a shattered Vorax colony, a single human relief ship descended, bearing medical supplies and clean water. No demands, no conquest. Only aid. The young Vorax scout who watched them from the rocks whispered to himself, "They fight like beasts, but they heal like ancestors." Back aboard the Retribution, Ilara Chin stood alone on the observation deck. Her uniform bore the marks of the campaign, but her eyes were far away on Earth perhaps, or on the stars themselves. Admiral Tormund approached quietly. "It's done," he said. Ilara didn't respond immediately. "Is it?" Tormund sighed. "As much as it ever can be. The galaxy has seen what happens when you ignore Earth's warnings." She nodded. "We were never supposed to be part of their plans." "No," he agreed. "We were their contingency. The final variable." There was a long silence. Then she said softly, "We showed them who we are." And outside the observation deck's glass, the remnants of war drifted. not as trophies, not as warnings, but as memories. Because humanity remembered everything, a message went out from Earth soon after, not to threaten, not to boast, but to offer a single line of truth. We do not seek dominion, only peace. But if peace is denied to us, then we are the last mistake you will ever make. That message would become legend, memorized by diplomats, feared by warlords, quoted by historians. And across the stars, children of many species would hear bedtime stories of the humans, how they were underestimated, how they rose, and how they ended a war the galaxy had already lost. Not with gods, not with miracles, with the indomitable will of a species that refused to die quietly. And they would all remember, humanity doesn't conquer, humanity ends wars.